Northwood High seemed like a typical American high school, with bustling hallways, classrooms filled with conversation, and bells ringing to break the silence. But hidden within this familiar environment was a special story. The story of Kayla Huntington, a quiet senior with depth hidden behind her almond-shaped eyes. Kayla always chose the shadows, preferring to remain unnoticed, a quiet observer of the turbulent world around her. Her vintage flight jacket, carefully stored and barely visible under her backpack, was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of her connection to her grandfather, an elite Special Forces veteran who had taught her restraint, discipline, and respect for strength. Every seam, every scuff on the jacket held memories and lessons that seemed more important now than ever. At school, on the other hand, Tristan Collins reigned supreme. His confident gait and predatory gaze made him the unshakable leader of the kings of the school. The captain of the football team, the son of an influential businessman, he wielded power backed by both popularity and parental influence. He was always accompanied by Sloane McGregor and Jace Eldridge, the former a master of manipulation, able to sense weakness in everyone, and the latter a human shield whose menacing figure inspired fear and did not allow for objections. The trio ruled the school with an iron grip, turning every day into a test for those who opposed them. Their confidence was so unquestionable that the hallways of Northwood High seemed like an arena of unwritten law. But Kayla wasn't alone in this battle of shadow versus light. Raven Morris, her best friend, was the quiet hero who always had the right words when they mattered. His loyalty didn't require anything in return. He simply understood Kayla's words. At their side was Eliza Vance, a shrewd social media strategist who was a master at defending Kayla from cyberbullying, orchestrating a wave of support, and dismantling toxic temptations with ease. Together they formed a small but powerful alliance, able to withstand not only physical pressure, but also the cunning of spreading ridicule online. The teachers saw what was happening, but the stony silence and fear of the powerful parents kept even those who wanted to intervene at bay. Garrett Wade, the social studies teacher, often watched from the sidelines. His gaze was lost in Kayla's, but the fear of the consequences of interfering paralyzed him. He struggled with his own sense of injustice, caught between duty and fear of Tristan's power. The atmosphere in the school thickened, like a tense web of anticipation of change or disaster. Every interval between lessons could become a moment when the situation would get out of control, and the shouting and laughter did not always seem like something harmless. In this tense atmosphere, an incident occurred that sparked a raging fire. In the cafeteria, Kayla, trying to slip past the crowd, accidentally knocked over Tyler Blake's tray. The drink spilled on the snow-white sneakers of a guy from Tristan's team, which instantly turned a simple encounter into an excuse for bullying. Tyler, who had initially just laughed with his friends, quickly changed. His smile disappeared along with the support of his friends and the fear of being ridiculed for being weak. This minor incident became a catalyst, setting off a chain of public humiliation and ridicule that moved from the hallways to social media and back again. Kayla became the target of constant bullying, being pushed in the hallways, having her personal belongings damaged, and countless online comments aimed at undermining her dignity. With Jace always standing close as if ready to intervene, and Sloane masterfully playing on her parents' fears and weaknesses, the tension grew. Despite this, Kayla remained calm, adhering to her grandfather's code that force was only a means of defense, not aggression. Her inner world was a strong refuge, but with each passing day the anger from injustice grew, turning into a quiet and unstoppable storm. Raven and Eliza became the backbone and brains of the fight against their enemies. Raven was able to spot weaknesses, and Eliza actively monitored the school networks, eliminating toxic comments and encouraging support among peers and even adults. Their work together showed that even in the darkest hallways, there's light to be found if you fight together. With each passing day, their alliance grew stronger, and the hope for change grew stronger. The teachers and administrators remained on the sidelines, afraid to upset the status quo. Garrett, though his fists were clenched with inner unease, continued to watch from the sidelines until the situation began to spiral out of control. This moment had been expected, like the heavy breathing before a storm. The school atmosphere, saturated with fear and silence, was cracking at the seams. Through all this storm, Kayla retained a hidden strength that could not be measured by external signs. Her vintage jacket, a fragile spirit level that showed true values, honor, dignity, and inner strength, was her stronghold. Every day when she entered school, she wore not just clothes, but a mass of memories and secret skills that none of her classmates could even guess. This story was just beginning to unfold. Soon, a simple accident would turn into a storm that would destroy the familiar order, upending the lives of many and forcing them to choose sides. Kayla stood on the threshold of change, painful but necessary. And although there was a struggle ahead, she was ready. Ready to find her voice and declare herself to all who still doubted the strength of a quiet but unbroken soul. The sounds of the approaching storm grew louder with every step, and the hallways of Northwood High creaked under the weight of the brewing conflict. Ahead lay the trials that would once again convince Kayla that the best way to change the world was to first change herself. The time for silence was over. The show had begun. Spark in the dining room. In the bustle of lunchtime in the cafeteria at Northwood High School, the space felt compressed to the limit. Kayla Huntington moved carefully between tables, holding a tray of food. Her eyes were hidden behind thick bangs, and her grandfather's vintage flight jacket, a symbol of family history and unquestioning discipline, lay softly on her shoulders. Kayla's every step was measured, as if she were walking a tightrope, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. She knew that here, in this labyrinth of school noise, it was almost impossible to hide, especially for those who, like her, preferred to remain in the shadows. The atmosphere in the mess hall that day was tense, crowded, and uncomfortable. The center of attention was Tristan Collins, striding triumphantly along with his entourage of Sloane McGregor and Jace Eldridge. Their confidence seemed to hang in the air, and the smirks directed at Kayla thickened the darkness around her. Sloane, with his cunning eyes, accurately noticed every awkward movement and was already making plans to escalate the situation in the digital space. Jace, a tall and massive shadow, protected his comrades like a human shield and intimidated by his appearance. Raven Morris sat quietly at the next table, his gaze flickering anxiously between Kayla and Tristan's group. He felt the tension of the moment, but he didn't intervene, merely analyzing the situation with care, preparing to lend support when the time came. Eliza Vance, running away from the cafeteria, was already checking the school's social media, planning a counterattack to the looming wave of cyberbullying. Teacher Garrett Wade, watching from afar, a slight frown of doubt creased his brow. His hands gripped his coffee cup tightly, as if he were drinking with hesitation in the face of the realization that silence could increase the cost of conflict. Tyler Blake, one of Tristan's comrades, stood with a tray, trying to look important. But he looked annoyed. Suddenly, as he passed by Kayla, he accidentally brushed her hand. The cold touch of the tray slipped, and the drink flew up in a warm spray onto his new pair of white sneakers. There was a moment of silence in the cafeteria, as if time had been suspended in an indecisive moment. Tyler looked at the bald spot on the light fabric, startled, his right hand clenching into a nervous fist. Kayla froze, feeling a hot lump rise in her chest. Tyler's gaze darted to her with sudden ferocity, and from that moment on, the invisible veil of secrecy began to slowly fray. Sloane chuckled at the flash, like the thinnest crossbow cord being pulled taut. Jace looked down at Kayla with a clear warning, his body a silent threat ready to burst in at the slightest movement. Kayla held her breath, her insides clenching, her fists clenching involuntarily until her nails dug into her palms. The first words to spread through the cafeteria were caustic whispers and teasing. Tyler, clearly relieved, joined Tristan's group, using the occasion as an excuse to play to the crowd. Sloane seized on the moment, unerringly inflaming classmates' feelings through hidden comments and innuendo, skillfully weaving bullying into cyberspace. The messages began to flow across social media, where Eliza was already in a flurry, quickly forming flash mobs in response and defending Kayla from online evil. A conflict was brewing inside Kayla that no one but herself could see. Her soul wavered between the legacy of her grandfather, tolerance, wisdom, restraint, and nonviolence, and the growing storm of anger that greedily demanded retribution. She remembered every word her grandfather had said about strength being needed to protect, and true power being found in self-control. Her heart was beating faster, and her mind was searching for a solution, while her fingers involuntarily touched her favorite flight jacket, as if searching for support and strength in its fabric. Raven, seeing the familiar struggle in her friend's eyes, quietly walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, silently conveying support. His presence was a reminder that Kayla wasn't alone in this fight. She nodded, smiling faintly. for the first time in a long time, not feeling completely vulnerable. Elise, meanwhile, was organizing a support team online, outlining the effectiveness and strategy for protecting Kayla from attacks from users supporting Tristan. She knew the battle would be fought on multiple fronts at once. Meanwhile, in the social studies classroom where Garrett Wade watched through the projection, his doubts grew. Every time he saw the power group reign supreme in the school and the administration turn a blind eye, his pulse quickened. His inner voice was telling him to act, but fear of Loretta Grayson's influence and Tristan's paternal authority made his movements cautious and deliberate. A sense of hopelessness hung in the air. The first blows of bullying were soft, barely noticeable, but so sinister that they became fertile ground for subsequent attacks. The caustic nicknames began during recess, forcing Kayla to cover her mouth to keep from bursting into tears. Sloan began his taunts in real life, his piercing gaze penetrating into the weakest spots. Jace, like an impenetrable wall, stood nearby, providing safety and strength to Tristan's group. In the school hallways, hostility became a real stone on the heart of more than one student. On social media, Sloan's efforts manifested themselves in a string of mean comments and jokes aimed at Kayla. Eliza, holding back her bitterness, quickly and wittily raised waves of support, using memes and short videos to introduce Kayla's real face and show the strength behind the silence. This battle in the information space was almost as significant and intense as the real-life conflicts. Every like, share, and comment became a front in the battle for justice. It was becoming increasingly difficult to keep within the confines of her grandfather's code. Kayla's nights were filled with thoughts like thunder, and her internal monologues became battle scenes where every impulse of rage fought with her restraint. She had learned that silence was not always golden. Sometimes it only fed the threat. A determination was stirring within her, burning, but demanding a rational outlet. Her grandfather's jacket, like a jaunty trophy, remained a constant reminder that true strength lay in self-control and honesty. The school hallways became the arena for new confrontations with each passing day. Tyler slowly noticed that the aggression he had used so actively was beginning to turn against him. Doubts and guilt towards Kayla, the person who had never responded to evil with evil, were surfacing deep in his heart. One day, looking at the darkly shining jacket, Tyler thought about his actions for the first time. A spark had entered his soul that could change the course of events. But before the spark becomes a flame, there are still many trials and discoveries ahead. There are conversations in the library, new strategies in the endless struggle, balanced decisions and support from allies. Kayla learns to hear not only the voices of her enemies, but also her own inner voice, which gradually becomes louder in the chaos and darkness of Northwood High. And as her fingers touch the fabric of her jacket, she understands that this is only the beginning. There is a new day ahead in which everything will change. Wheel of increasing pressure, the pressure on Kayla grew with each passing day, like an invisible ball of string tightening around the shoulders of Northwood High. Tristan followed her like a shadow, his icy gaze watching her every move. His team surrounded her like a deadly whirlwind, never giving her a moment's peace. Jace followed her like a living wall, his massive frame making her hesitate to resist. Every time she passed by in the hallways, his presence was like the looming rumble of an approaching storm. Sloan spun his webs like a spider in the halls of the school and beyond. His caustic comments on social media crawled like poison into the minds of his classmates. Using his parents' influence, he skillfully manipulated the administrative framework, forcing teachers to turn a blind eye to the obvious. Garrett Wade's gaze increasingly focused on Kayla, but his fear of the influence of figures like Loretta Grayson prevented him from intervening directly. Kayla swallowed her irritation, clenching her fingers into a fist, feeling a hidden storm building inside her. Her gaze often slid to the vintage flight jacket, the only fragment of her grandfather's legacy, a reminder of the principles of strength and honor. She remembered his lessons, how he patiently taught her not to let evil defeat her. But the wall of silence and fear of her surroundings pressed harder and harder, forcing her thoughts to wander between patience and outbursts of anger. Raven, a constant source of support, listened carefully to Kayla's every word, helping her parse every whisper and hint. His quiet confidence was a strength, allowing her to channel her emotions into determination, rather than letting them spill over into trivialities. Together they looked for weaknesses in their opponents, in Jace's awkward gestures, in Sloane's veiled demands of his teachers, in Tyler's clumsy attempts to appear authoritative. Eliza picked up on these data, turning them into strategy for battle in virtual space. Eliza expertly brought dozens of toxic comments to light, blocking and neutralizing each attack. Her virtual battlefield was as important as any real school hallway. Behind her screen, an invisible front unfolded, where every like and share became a weapon against injustice. Her eyes lit up with the understanding that Kayla's future depended on the ability to pool not just physical strength, but social power. With each passing day, the shadows gathered thicker. Jace became more intrusive, his rudeness crossing the line, zipping the harassment to a new level of menace. He stalked Kayla, forcing students to look away, as if their silence was part of a game in which she was the hero with no time to pause. Sloan, using all the cunning and manipulation, wove plans, poisoning the atmosphere with the subtlest stings of lies and betrayal. The teachers stood like stone statues, inert and uncaring. Garrett watched, conflicted, sensing the growing injustice, but his hands remained tied. His eyes followed Kayla with quiet regret, and he wondered how he could break down the silent wall of fear without hurting his own position. This school was a battleground not only between students, but between endless social barriers and adult fears. Kayla learned to control her reactions, hiding her inner fire behind calm. Every moment of pressure became a spark that ignited her inner resolve. She observed the behavior of Tristan and his minions, revealing insecurities in their vast power. Sloan always hid fear behind a mask of arrogance, Jace a blind strength without intelligence, and Tristan a stage leadership that needed extra support. The outer confidence concealed cracks, just waiting to be exploited. Raven picked out moments of weakness in the others' conversations, and Eliza turned those ploys into tactical moves. Their strategy was built on small victories, carefully woven into a sense of their own strength. They risked going against the grain, knowing that the price was not only peace, but safety. Tyler, Tristan's fellow soldier, would occasionally flit through the halls, an uncertain figure, and Kayla would notice his hesitation, waiting for the moment when the tension would break him too. The tensions weren't just building at school. Parent groups, backed by powerful figures like Loretta Grayson, were tightening their administrative nooses to try to eliminate any signs of protest. But the growing social media presence that Eliza had championed was countering that pressure. Comments and posts were beginning to cross school boundaries, gathering more and more people around Kayla to listen and support her. A web of hope was being woven, providing a safety net when it was needed most. The hallways of Northwood High echoed with conversations and whispers, each word carrying a growing resonance. Kayla, watching this change, felt a new strength growing within her. Her silence became a weapon, not of weakness, but of focused energy, waiting for the right moment to break through the darkness of humiliation and fear. Together with Raven and Eliza, she plotted moves that could change the course of events, not just repel attacks, but upend the established system. The sudden outburst of anger flared up more and more often, but Kayla remembered her grandfather's lessons. Strength is not in the first blow, but in the ability to maintain control. This balance was a fine line between salvation and failure, between victory and defeat. She studied each enemy like a chess player at the board, preparing her moves. Every look, every word became part of an unnoticed game, where the stakes were higher than simple school glory. Tristan, sensing resistance, began to change tactics. His charisma morphed into more brutal displays of power, and the persecution became more public and vicious. Kayla had to navigate between trying to save face and the genuine need to finally fight back. Words and actions became weapons, and the school hallways became the arena of an invisible war to be heard. Tyler, shoulder to shoulder with Tristan, was increasingly experiencing internal turmoil. After hearing Kayla's words of encouragement, and then her confident voice on social media, he began to question the paths he had chosen under pressure from friends and family. These doubts were the first cracks in the pressure they were putting on each other. His sincere apology hadn't changed much yet, but it had begun a process that could lead to new, unexpected turns. While the school was living with this increasing tension, Kayla and her allies did not waste the moment to act, collecting pieces of information, strength, and support. Each day brought new ruptures in the shadow that Tristan's group created, and social media and small victories strengthened the belief that her cause was not useless. Their strategy became not just revenge, but a fight for justice, where the truth could not be ignored. In the corners of the classrooms and sports fields, Conversations died down, replaced by looks filled with new meaning. Kayla sensed that change was near, that the upheaval at school would not be long in coming. Her silence gave way to action, and her heart filled not only with pain, but also with hope for a brighter future. Tristan's domain of power was cracking at the seams, and in this fragile moment, a new force was born, capable of choosing not revenge, but true respect. The atmosphere at school was still tense and unpredictable, but Kayla was no longer the quiet figure in the shadows. Her team, drawing on each other's strengths, was preparing for the next step that could ultimately change the rules of the game. Together, their efforts, planning, and support were laying the foundation for a showdown where every move could be a turning point. Kayla's inner world, filled with fear and anger, gradually turned into a source of strength and clarity. Her path was difficult and full of trials, but thanks to the support of her friends and her own tenacity, she realized that true victory does not come from crushing opponents, but from maintaining honor and dignity. This lesson was something that her grandfather left in her not only in her flight jacket, but in her heart. Night was falling on the city as Kayla looked down one last time at her torn jacket, a symbol of struggle and legacy. The next few days would be trying, but there was a fire of determination in her eyes. Words, dreams, and action were woven into a single chain, ready to be broken. This was not just a standoff, it was the beginning of a new story, where justice could triumph over fear and silence, and Kayla knew she was no longer alone. As she closed her evening, she quietly said to herself that the world feared those who found their true voice, and that voice would soon be heard, louder than ever. Raven and Eliza were waiting ahead, as was the next, most crucial stage. This was the moment when everything could change, because the pressure that seemed unbearable was turning into fuel for the fight. Their fight was just beginning, and in it, there was a living hope. A tear in the jacket, a tear in the silence. The air in the cafeteria at Northwood High School was thick, the tension hanging around every step like a high-voltage cable ready to explode. Kayla Huntington walked carefully between the tables, keeping her eyes hidden under the hood of her grandfather's beloved but worn flight jacket. Her heart was beating like a drum, but she kept her expression calm, her years of restraint hiding the storm within. There was not only weariness in her eyes, but also a hidden determination, fueled by memories of her grandfather, his lessons, and his promises to uphold honor. This mark was more than just clothing to her, a symbol of a strength she had not yet fully unleashed. The crowd of students, as if ready for a freak show, focused curiously on the table where Kayla sat. Tristan Collins stood in the shadows against the wall, a cheeky grin on his face, his eyes glowing with absolute power. Next to him, Sloane McGregor radiated a cold sarcasm, demonstrating how easily one could play with others' fears and pain. Jace Eldridge, a stone monument to aggression, took up a position nearby, ready to pounce if the situation got out of hand. They wielded an invisible whip of social pressure that wielded it over the school corridors and the hearts of the rest of the students. Kayla knew this moment was no accident. Her chance encounter with Tyler a few days ago, the loss of a drink on her expensive shoe, had been the spark for a growing fire. Now all eyes were on her, as if she were a target for public execution. Every whisper, every sneer, was like a blade. At that moment, Raven Morris approached, his gaze filled with quiet support, like an anchor holding her in the vortex of disaster. Eliza Vance stood next to her, checking her phone, ready to unleash a wave of online resistance at any moment. Saloan grinned and pointed at Kayla's flight jacket as if the size of it meant something to their world. Tristan stepped forward, his voice booming through the cafeteria like a thunderclap as he grabbed the jacket's sleeve and without a moment's hesitation, ripped the material sharply before the astonished eyes of his classmates. The soft rustle of fabric, the weight of humiliation, each piece felt like a knife piercing not just a material object but a soul. There was a brief moment of silence before a cascade of sighs and a barrage of jeers erupted. Kayla's heart sank. Her lips trembled, and the anger that could no longer be hidden burst through her barrier of restraint. Reflexes, cultivated not by years of helplessness but by her grandfather's martial arts lessons, suddenly kicked in. A quick movement, a sudden lunge, and Kayla quickly and accurately disarmed Jace, leaving him unable to strike. while Sloane, frozen in surprise, had no time to soften the situation with words. A tense silence filled the dining room, the air oscillating between fear and admiration. She raised her hand so that everyone could see the torn jacket, her face suddenly lit up with an inner fire that did not fit in with her usual silence. Kayla's voice rang out loud and clear, piercing the space. This is not just a jacket. This is the legacy, the memory, and the strength of my grandfather. Do you think that breaking a thing can break me? No. True strength does not come from fear and violence, but from honesty and respect. Who among you is ready to take responsibility for your actions and not hide behind the masks of soulless power? Her words, filled with passion, caused a wave of confusion and general silence. Raven stepped forward, his gaze intensely supporting his friend as Eliza was already uploading the video online for the entire city to see what was happening within the school. Tristan, stunned by the loss of control, tried to rally his team, but the sudden change in the atmosphere was palpable. Even Garrett Wade, who had been watching from afar, could no longer remain passive. A new understanding and desire to intervene appeared in his eyes. In that moment, Tyler, who had to bear Kayla's wrath a couple of days ago, slowly approached her with sincere words of apology. His eyes were shining with guilt, and his voice seemed to awaken the awareness of mistakes and the desire to correct them. His action became a small bridge of hope that change is brewing inside even the most unexpected people. Kayla looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was not alone in this fight. The jacket's rip became the catalyst for not just a conflict, but a revolution of spirit in the school's atmosphere. Total suppression gave way to a new force that fed on honor and truth. The administration had already begun to hear the voices of students and parents, and the influence of old connections was slowly losing its former power. Kayla's eyes burned with the realization that the fight was just beginning, and her inner voice would never be silent again. And so the day ended, leaving behind a trail of change and hope that new challenges lay ahead to dispel the darkness and raise the light of justice at Northwood High School. Kayla realized for the first time that her true strength lay not in her jacket or her fighting skills, but in her willingness to fight for herself and those who could not defend themselves. Her friends were there, and the path to the next battle was open before them. The voice of strength and honor. The crowd in the cafeteria fell silent instantly, as if the air itself had grown heavy with tension. Kayla, standing at the edge of a long row of tables, slowly raised her hands, clutching the tattered pieces of her grandfather's flight jacket tightly. Her eyes burned with unwavering determination, a core of inner strength that was being released in that moment. All this chaos, bullying, and fear now seemed like just the beginning of a new story, one that she was determined to write herself. Tristan's ragged breathing betrayed his confusion. Once again, it was plain for all to see. Kayla hadn't simply given up. She was a different person than she had once seemed as a silent shadow in the school's hallways. And now her voice filled the room, soft but unforgiving. This isn't just a jacket. It's a legacy, a symbol of honor and discipline. Strength doesn't come from breaking someone, it comes from protecting yourself and others. Her words spread quickly through the tricky holes, forcing her fellow sufferers to see the steel beneath the surface. At first, confusion was visible on the faces of several of the boys, but gradually their eyes filled with respect and understanding. Raven, who was standing next to her, silently exchanged a supportive look with her, demonstrating that they were not alone in this cruel world. Eliza was already reaching for the phone to start a wave of support on social networks. This is where the turning point began. But all this was maintained on a fine line. The balance was restored only thanks to mutual support, which was born of real fire. Sloane pressed his lips together, trying to hide his growing panic, disbelieving what he was seeing. His usual manipulation had failed here. Jace stood transfixed, his body sagging from the lack of a signal to respond to this new reality. Only Tyler, who had been assenting to Tristan just a moment ago, now shifted from side to side, obviously realizing the error of his ways. His eyes met Kayla's, and there was genuine, remorseful pain in them. Social studies teacher Garrett Wade, who had been standing on the sidelines for a long time, took a deep breath. He had seen this girl not only literally, but symbolically break the old barriers of inaction. His inner conflict was easy to read in the tense lines on his face, duty to the system versus the thirst for justice. Right now, His shadow was shifting, and he knew that silence was no longer an option. The explosion of emotion in the cafeteria became a catalyst, changing the power dynamics. Kayla's words pierced the ice of fear and indifference, awakening a sense of personal responsibility in the students. The environment, which had once been unambiguously hostile, became more pliable. Many were already quietly discussing the need for change, forming unobtrusive alliances, strengthening themselves in the hope of something better. Kayla's very presence on this emotional field became a symbol of struggle and liberation. Her jacket, though torn, took on new meaning. It became an engine of resistance against oppression and injustice. The energy she breathed into her classmates was like an electric current, causing hearts to beat faster and minds to awaken. Unwittingly, no one could ignore this new chapter of relationships at Northwood High any longer. And while fear and disappointment still reigned on the surface, this was the first blow that could change the rules of the game. With every word and every look, the revealed facets of the human soul became more obvious, inviting others to step beyond their own doubts. Raven walked up to Kayla and quietly said, "You've ignited something that's been dormant in all of us. We're with you." His voice didn't ask for confirmation. His support was unconditional and rock solid. Eliza had already started a chat, gathering voices of support to use the power of the internet as a new front in the fight against bullying and toxicity. These small steps were turning into a movement. Tristan, both disheartened and angry, tried to regain his lost influence, but his words now sounded hollow and meaningless. He no longer had the unconditional faith behind him, and his crown was tottering on his head. The damage done by Kayla's jacket and speech had cut through the layer of illusion he had spent so long building. The realization that ruling through fear would no longer work was beginning to choke him. Against this backdrop, Tyler tapped Kayla on the shoulder. His gaze changed from the silent instigator to the man willing to take responsibility. "I'm sorry. I realized how wrong I was," he said simply, but with a sincerity that could not be faked. This small act of recognition made another breach in the wall of injustice. Garrett, watching all this unfold, finally realized that reform had to start with himself. His silence might have been an act of naive neutrality, but today, it was broken. He was prepared to take the first step so that the school would no longer be an arena of cruelty and injustice, but a place of support and understanding. Kayla, feeling like she had built a bridge between worlds, smiled softly. Losing the jacket was hard, but she realized that true legacy was not a thing, but a fortitude. Her eyes gleamed with determination to continue the fight, to make the cafeteria and all of Northwood High a place of equality and strength for all. In that moment, everyone present felt the school's world changing, fear beginning to give way to hope. And though the battles to come were yet to come, the foundations of a new order had been laid. Kayla and her comrades looked at each other with understanding and strength, ready for the next test to come. Step by step, she was no longer the quiet girl who hid in the shadows. She was a voice of strength and honor that could not be ignored, and who embodied the dream of justice in the darkness of the school corridors. Now that the first chapter of the struggle had been written, a new day at Northwood High began with a spark of change, inviting everyone to walk toward the light, regardless of the shadows of the past. The aftermath of the battle and new alliances. After the climactic confrontation in the cafeteria, the world around Kayla began to change, as if awakening from a long winter's slumber. Tyler, who often stood in Tristan's shadow, now looked at her differently. His eyes, usually hiding naked pride, wavered as he extended a hand in sincere apology. "Kayla, I was wrong." The words were spoken quietly, but with such force that they seemed heavier than any reproach. In that moment, the atmosphere of Northwood High seemed almost fairy tale-like, not tense, but filled with new possibilities. Eliza, watching every move, was already working behind the scenes on her own front. The first lights of support lit up on her laptop screen, hundreds of comments, memes, and posts that turned resentment into strength. She skillfully directed the movement, turning the school cyberspace into a safe haven for Kayla and her friends. Every like, every repost became a hum of hostile indifference, sweeping away the darkness of injustice. "We are together," sang the lines in her mental speech as the screen filled with messages of support. Teacher Garrett Wade watched for a long moment, as if arguing with himself. His fingers nervously fiddled with the pen on his desk, reflecting the conflict within him. The power of generations of parents, the habit of silence, the fear of his reputation. All of it had stifled his voice. But now that the invisible line had been crossed, the shadow of change began to creep through the doubts. He saw Kayla as more than just a student, but a person with a fiery gaze and a defiant spirit. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think that he might side with justice. There was a noticeable change in the hallways of the school. Students who had previously avoided Kayla began to approach her, their gazes warmer and more genuinely interested. Raven, standing nearby and ready to support at any moment, noticed these small signs of change with a patient smile. He knew that the fight was not over, but for the first time in a long time, a light appeared in the hearts of his classmates, a light of hope and faith in the best. Together with Eliza and Garrett, they were forming a new core of resistance that could no longer be ignored. The opponents, of course, did not disappear without a fight. Tristan, still coolly calm, kept a discontent in the depths of his eyes. He knew that an attack on his power had begun, and he was preparing to respond. Sloane and Jace gathered their team in the shadows of the sports fields, looking for weaknesses and devising new methods of pressure. But what had once seemed unshakable was now shaky. The taut webs of fear were snapping, giving way to the excitement of change. In the cafeteria, where the water had returned after the storm, Kayla clutched her torn flight jacket, a symbol of her heritage and her grandfather's memory. Her fingers gently brushed the frayed seams, and her eyes glowed not with bitterness, but with determination. The fabric had been damaged, but not the spirit. She felt the strength growing inside her, filling her with every passing minute with the readiness to protect those who had been afraid to speak out for so long. This is just the beginning, Kayla thought, looking at her reflection in a store window on the street outside the school. The administration, finally awakening from its long slumber, began to take its first tentative steps. News of the conflict reached the principals' and advocates' offices, where many were preparing to meet with parents and the person in charge. Loretta Grayson Tyler's mother and a powerful figure felt her position begin to weaken. Behind-the-scenes meetings, strategies were discussed that would preserve face, but with an eye on the new power dynamics emerging at the school. In hourly social media updates, Eliza coordinated support groups, calling for unity and mutual support. She watched as the online group grew into a living movement, where every voice became a voice for dignity and honesty. Kayla's posts, accompanied by photos of her flight jacket and her speech from the cafeteria, inspired thousands of students across the school. Virtual walls cracked as old barriers crumbled under the onslaught of truth. Raven, always nearby, had long conversations with Kayla after class. He didn't just listen, he asked questions, helping her analyze events and plan for the future. Their bond grew stronger, an unbreakable alliance based not only on friendship, but also on a common fight for justice. "You're not alone," he said quietly, reminding her that true strength comes from support and faith. Meanwhile, a new meaning for the word resistance began to emerge at school. Student groups led by Eliza met in the library and on the sports fields to discuss not only strategies for resistance, but ways to create a fairer, kinder school. The noise was perestroika, punctuated by jokes and talk of a future free of fear and humiliation. Garrett Wade, finally empowered, led a public lesson on justice and personal responsibility. His voice was loud and clear, spurring students to reflect and change. He was one of the first adults to stand with the new leaders of the school revolution, which gave Kayla hope and confidence. Tyler, having shed his mask in fear, began to actively participate in all events, helping to correct mistakes and restore trust. His changes were not immediately accepted by everyone, but the first step was taken, and he knew that the path to respect is a road paved with patience and sincerity. There was now a grateful gleam in his eyes, confirming that in this struggle, not only confrontation but also forgiveness is possible. The turbulent days at Northwood High gradually gave way to rare moments of calm when students came together without fear or humiliation. Kayla, at the center of these changes, felt the weight of loneliness mingle with the warmth of community. Together with her allies, they were creating a new history for the school, one where even the darkest times could give way to dawn. The effects of the battle extended far beyond the flight jacket. Teen drama met the harsh realities of life, but most importantly, the triumph of inner strength over suppression and fear emerged as a new standard. At this point, Kayla knew there were more challenges ahead, but now she was ready to move forward, clearly hearing her voice and feeling the support of those around her. The heroine's inner world was filled with an unwavering determination not to let the shadows of the past ever again obscure the light. In response to the challenges of the era, she would become a defender of those who had been left without a voice. This night, spent among friends and allies, was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where hope and courage were inextricably intertwined, and injustice had no right to exist. When the final bell rang through the halls of Northwood High, it seemed as if the old order had passed with it, giving way to a new era. In this renewed space, Kayla and her team prepared for the battles to come, knowing that they would face challenges worthy of heroes. But now they were united not only by the struggle, but also by faith in a future where everyone could be heard and protected. A light of hope in the midst of deep darkness. Kayla stood in the middle of the dining room, where the shouts and whispers around her were already dying down, as if after a storm. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, but her gaze was piercingly steady. Her grandfather's torn flight jacket, the symbol of her entire life, lay on the floor, strewn with torn threads and shreds of fabric. She could not believe that the thing she had treasured since childhood had now fallen victim to the tyranny of Tristan and his retinue. But despite the destruction, something new had flared up deep within her, a determination and strength that had not been visible before. Raven approached cautiously, looking at her with concern but also admiration. "You did it, Kayla. You showed them that silence was no longer an option." His words were a quiet confession, as if there was more to them than just support for a friend. Eliza was soon after him, holding her phone and publicly blocking the flood of negative comments that had erupted in the aftermath of the scene. Her fingers were rapidly typing out responses, boldly confronting the detractors, as if there was a living energy of change in these actions. Tristan stood to the side, fuming with anger and humiliation, an alien sense of loss of control. Sloane smiled slyly, trying to smooth things over and divert attention, and Jace clenched his fists, unable to hide his growing irritation. This was the beginning of the end of their reign of impunity. The handful of students hidden in the crowd began to mutter among themselves, and many eyes lit up with a spark of hope. It was as if a network had closed, and the monsters that were consuming the school were on the brink of collapse. Inside Kayla, a turbulent maelstrom of emotions fought with brutal conclusions. On the one hand, her grandfather's code forbade the use of force unless there was a real threat. On the other, she felt those words no longer a constraint, but a call. The thirst for justice that lived in every beat of her heart demanded not only protection, but change. She could no longer ignore the inaction of her teachers, their fear of powerful families, and the indifference of her classmates. Garrett, watching from the edge of the cafeteria, felt the familiar structure of the school crumbling before his eyes. His once passive attitude had been replaced by an inner sense of alarm. He remembered teachers afraid to intervene for fear of the consequences, and children left alone with their fears. Now he had a living example of how a single spark could ignite a fire, and that fire was already blazing, inside everyone who had once felt powerless. Tyler approached hesitantly, his eyes filled not only with apology but also with genuine remorse. "Kayla," his voice shook, the words demanding a heavy apology. "I'm sorry for everything I've done. I didn't mean for it to go this far." She turned to him, watching as the man who had seemed like an extension of tyranny suddenly became a man capable of understanding another's pain. The moment was a small victory, not only over power, but over the humanity that could reawaken even where it seemed lost. Reluctantly, school administrators began to take action. Loretta Grayson's influence began to crunch as children began to organize, and parents began to ask for the truth and demand change. Eliza launched online campaigns of support that quickly gained momentum, ripping through the space with messages of the power of every voice and resilience in the face of injustice. Social media was finally no longer an arena for anger, but a platform for hope. One night at home, Kayla looked at the torn jacket, feeling a bittersweet mixture of loss and gain. The jacket was just fabric, albeit filled with her grandfather's memories and strength. The true legacy was deeper, in her courage, in her voice, loud and clear for the first time, in her ability to stand up for herself and others. A rage that could now be channeled into building justice, rather than suppressing her own fear. She felt a new energy awakening within her, the energy of a fighter who would not back down. This strength did not need to be destroyed to be real. Her weapons were words, actions, and the support of her friends who stood by her side on this difficult journey. Remembering her grandfather, she knew that he would look with pride at the fact that his legacy lived on in her and continued to fight no matter what. The school slowly emerged from the grip of fear. The sounds of Raven and Elise's voices, confident and resolute, mingled with the nascent sense of community among the students. Each small step created a new path toward the light, paved for those who were tired of being afraid. Kayla and her allies stood at the threshold of a new chapter, where fear gave way to hope, and struggle to the promise of justice. This night was not an end, but a beginning. Strength was awakening around her, and Kayla knew that there were many more battles to fight. But now, she was not alone. Her inner world was filled with the certainty that every injury was a lesson, every loss a new stronghold for further victories. Courage found a voice and became an inspiration to all who had remained in the shadows for too long. And so, amidst the shadows of Northwood High School, a light arose, dispelling the darkness, stirring hearts, and awakening a desire to change the world. Kayla stepped forward, knowing that there was much more to be done, but the first battle had already been won. And this victory sounded louder than any words, because it was real, born from the fire of pain, hope, and strength of the soul. New Dawn Northwood. The silence behind Kayla was almost tangible as she walked slowly through the old halls of Northwood High, feeling the cold gaze on her, as if an invisible net of doubt and worry had tightened around her shoulders. Her vintage flight jacket, now bursting at the seams with tragedy, hung in her memory as a symbol of all that had been lost and gained. Somewhere in the distance, Tristan Collins's harsh voice was a hint of aggression, a challenge she accepted, smiling at her own reflection in the schedules on the walls. A new fire flared up in my soul, quiet but unquenchable. Hope for change. Raven, standing next to her, didn't say a word, but his gaze said it all. Support without words, and a promise not to retreat. Eliza stared at her phone with a slight nod, announcing that she had prepared a new wave of support on social media. This team seemed to be born from the ashes of fatigue, turning into something more than just a union of the honest and the brave. They were the voice of those who had long been silent, the force breaking through fear and despair. School hours were almost over, and outside the windows the sports fields were empty, like waiting. Garrett Wade, usually reserved and reserved, took a deep breath, feeling the change almost as keenly as the others. His eyes noted how the students who had once been afraid to look up at Tristan's team were now slowly changing direction, following Kayla in her speech about dignity and resilience that had echoed in the souls of many. Tyler Blake, once a simple participant in the ridicule, now approached Kayla cautiously, not with mockery, but with a sincere desire to apologize for mistakes that were not too late to correct. His words, devoid of the usual malice, were the beginning of a new chapter, where one could find not only forgiveness, but also the understanding that even the darkest pages can be rewritten if there is courage. The school corridors were gradually coming to life, no longer just a place where the tyranny of kings reigned. It was a space where a dialogue of truth and support could unfold, where one whisper of protest could turn into a loud chorus of change. The invisible wall that divided students into us and them was crumbling under the pressure of new energy. Sloan McGregor, left behind without his former power, now tried in vain to maintain control, but old patterns were unraveling and old fears were giving way to understanding. His manipulations no longer worked as they once did. Tristan, seeing his foundations crumble, felt that power was a fragile illusion, requiring constant effort and control. But even he suddenly sensed the seed of change planted by Kayla. Jason Eldridge, though still formidable, could not help but notice how the atmosphere around him was changing. How many school children stopped bowing to fear, choosing truth and justice. His role as a human shield began to melt in the air of an altered consciousness, where strength took on a new meaning. With each passing day, support for Kayla grew not only within the school, but also beyond its walls. Videos of her speech quickly spread across the internet, causing active responses, uniting those tired of passivity and injustice. Eliza, masterfully building campaigns, ensured that the voice of this struggle was heard and heard loudly. That night, as the school lights dimmed, Kayla stood at the threshold of a new era, not just as a girl who had taken the punches, but as a leader who was ready to lead. Her inner conflict, once a gnawing at her soul, was now fuel for action. Restraint had given way to determination, and her deep respect for strength had given way to the understanding that the strength within was enough to be a light in dark places. The friends gathered in a cozy corner of the library where the soft light of the lamp created an atmosphere of safety and trust. They talked about next steps, about how to continue to fight without losing their humanity, about how support is the key to long-term change. Garrett finally offered to help openly, in numbers and words, promising to be an ally not only in the classroom but also outside it. Among those faces filled with new hope and strength, Kayla ran her fingers over her grandfather's tattered jacket one last time, paying tribute and promising to carry on that legacy like a torch in the night. It was a symbol not only of the past, but of the future she and her friends were building. And though there were still many trials, misunderstandings, and struggles ahead, in every look, in every word, there was a determination not to give up. This was a new dawn for Northwood High, a light of awakening that would long be reflected in the hearts of those who were willing to stand for the truth. The story of that day, like a drop of water that can wash away the stones of change, left open the door to the next chapter. No less difficult, but already in many ways different, with hope, strength, and the power of a community that is ready to rise up and change before everyone's eyes. It was in this glimmer of the future that Kayla and her allies once again greeted the dawn.